Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Occupancy, the data that is the future of facilities management. I'm Jennifer Getz, the editorial director of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by Robin, the leading workplace management platform for advanced in-office productivity. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. There will be a question and answer segment at the end of the presentation today. Please find the question box in the dashboard on your screen. This is where you can submit questions for our speakers today. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send us a message via that question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. Now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce your speakers for today. Micah Remley is the CEO of Robin. Micah brings more than 20 years of experience helping growth stage technology companies achieve tremendous growth. Most recently, he served as the Chief Executive Officer at Mineral Tree, contributing to the company's rapid expansion and entry into new markets. Remley holds a Bachelor's of Science in Ecology from the University of Maine and a Strategy MBA from Yale School of Management. Brian Muse, co-founder and CTO of co-founded Robin. As an entrepreneur and software engineer, Brian saw an opportunity to help organizations create productive and vibrant workplaces by providing innovative tools along with rich data and insights. Brian currently serves as the company's chief technology officer, leading the organization's technology innovation and digital product development. So Micah, Brian, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to kick off today's webinar with a poll. Okay, so what kinds of workplace data would help you do your job more effectively? What would make your job easier? Check all that apply. So you can choose between resource usage, occupancy, employee feedback / input about the office, maintenance, service request, office visitor trends, and energy consumption. You have about 20 to 30 seconds to respond. Micah, Brian, what kind of responses are you guys expecting?
Probably a bit of all of them, actually. So one of my last companies, I see the energy consumption one, and we were specifically focused on facilities managers helping with energy consumption. Now, one thing we know is that we're certainly seeing sustainability from a corporate standpoint becoming less important. We see that across some of our customers, but in some places, especially Europe, it's still really important. So it probably depends on where some of the audience is right now. But I'm expecting that a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, so it looks like our results are in. It looks like occupancy was the number one at 67%, and that was followed by, looks like a tie between resource usage, employee feedback, and then it was followed by maintenance / service request trends. Wow, very interesting. So perfect. So now, the way we manage facilities has changed a lot since 2020. Can you dive into how things have changed?
Brian? Yeah, so what we've noticed is a few things have changed as far as managing facilities, and especially what we looked at was before pandemic. What you really were looking at was a headcount plan. Once you had that headcount plan for an organization, then you could dive into what the specific needs were around the facility, plan it, build it, and then really operate that facility going forward. Then that changed, obviously. The pandemic happened in office spaces specifically, obviously a little different for manufacturing spaces and some other spaces. But in office space specifically, people went home and then you sort of had the inventory you had. So really, it got simpler in some ways that you're beyond health and safety. There's that health and safety push for a little while. But then it became, all right, we're going to operate the portfolio that we have and really look and see, all right, do we need to optimize that? Do we need to shrink our square footage? What does that look like? So that is obviously how things changed in that pandemic time period. And then now what we've seen is we've really seen us come out the other side of it, which is it's gotten a lot more complex. So we have thousands of customers around the globe that are managing their facilities. And what we see, the common thread is, all right, I used to just be able to have this headcount plan and think about what the space needs are. But now I need to understand what my company's my evolving in-office policy is associated with it. Typically, what we're seeing is companies are having one high-level mandate, if they have a mandate, or none at all. But then individual departments, functions, and offices have very different reasons for using the office and maybe their own mandates associated with it. That managing a flexible office has its own issues associated with managing the flexible office. So all of these then combined with the space needs, which you needed before, allow you to come up with that facility strategy and plan. So getting a handle on these pieces of data, understanding them, synthesizing them, and then creating a plan is really the challenge right now. And we just hear this thousands of times over from people managing facilities around the world. And in fact, one of our customers said this really well. They said, managing a traditional office was so much easier than managing a flexible office. So I think what we had is this real change in the curve, which was managing a regular office seemed really challenging. We kind of went through managing during COVID, the initial few months of COVID, which were really crazy around health and safety. Then we settled into rhythm, which the offices were kind of empty. So managing them was a little simpler. Now people are trying to come back in the office, but it's a very different office than they left when before the pandemic. And that's creating all sorts of new challenges. And people are really thirsty for information to drive decisions in the office. And I think that's clearly the point of this webinar. We're going to talk through what types of data are they looking at? Why are they looking at that types of data? So that's what we're going to dive into.
Perfect. Thank you. So we know that a lot of companies are starting to gather data. So what type of data do you see them gathering?
Yeah, so related to the poll question, right? I wanted to start here with a chart probably most of us are familiar with and almost everyone is measuring, right? Which is occupancy. And I think there's a lot of talk out there and in the news around occupancy rates. And certainly, we see a lot of businesses and our own customers making large real estate or facilities decisions based on occupancy levels alone. And while it does tell us something, it's really a one-dimensional view of how our workspaces are actually being used. It's backwards looking. It's not really telling us much that we don't already know. And not only does managing, modern and especially flexible workplaces necessitate a deeper level of data and insight, but we should now, expect deeper levels of data and insight from the workplace platforms that we're using.
So there's a lot of data out there, and we know occupancy data isn't enough. What kind of office data points are most impactful for facility managers when reassessing their workplace priorities?
Yeah, so occupancy data, right? Really just the tip of the iceberg, and the most basic level of insight we could be thinking about. And in a moment, we'll get to some new powerful ways we can measure our workplaces, but I first wanted to give this example about how even double clicking one level deeper into occupancy can already tell us a whole bunch more, right? Based on desk inventory and card swipes, you might think that you're 90% occupied on Wednesdays, but the impact on the actual spaces might vary greatly between those peak days and off days or across floors or buildings in ways that might materially impact your facility strategy, right? Maybe you can cut or repurpose conference rooms into different kinds of collaborative or community space or seating. Maybe Fridays you can shut down a couple floors. Maybe you can flex into shared building conference rooms on peak days, right? And as we get later into this presentation, you'll learn that these sorts of changes in strategy, they won't just impact costs, but will also drive additional business outcomes that we can now provably and defensively measure for your leadership teams.
So I want to tell a little story about this chart specifically. On the left is, these are Robin offices. These are our actual offices. So using our own example, we are 100% occupied. So if you look at occupied on our busiest days, we're 100% occupied. But this is the double clicking one level lower shows that our conference rooms, this is what spaces are 75% occupied on our busiest days. If I go a little level deeper on the right, what we see is our conference rooms on our average day is only 21% occupied, way less than what our just pure occupancy numbers would be. So we are actually moving offices right now where we're signed a lease and we're going through that process of changing office space. And as we think about our new office space, this is really impacting the design of that new office space. What we can think about is We actually need less conference room space because the data shows that out. And we can rely on flex space within the building to fill that need. Back to that peak day capacity, when we have it, we can use flex space in the building to use that, whereas our own conference room space will be able to clear our averages much more regularly. So that's why taking that next level down below occupancy allows you to really think about how your individual spaces are managed. And as Brian said, we'll get deeper into this as we go further into the data.
Perfect. Thank you, Micah. Now, what do management teams care about, and how does it connect to what facility managers are thinking about? And
Yeah, it's
I
a really
think
good
it's
question. So I'm going to dive into that. So this question of what leadership cares about, I think we have a poll here, right?
yes,
All
yes, we
right,
have
great.
a poll kicking off pretty soon.
Yeah,
Here we
yeah.
are. So, on average, how many meetings in conference rooms are a single person alone in the room? So, 80%, 53%, 33%, or 15%. Again, you have about 20 to 30 seconds to respond.
So this question is, how many people of conference rooms that are used in office space, how many people are sitting alone in the room doing a Zoom call or single person work, not anybody else in the room with them, just one person sitting in a room?
Okay, it looks like the majority is about 33%. Um, 33%, and then followed by 15%, and then closing out 53, and then 80 is at 17%. So,
Yeah. So we see a lot of variability here. This is when I give the answer part. Yeah. So we see a lot of variability here. The actual answer is across. So we measure this for tens of thousands of offices around the globe. The average across all offices, 53%. So over half of meetings. So that if you did 53%, great job, you got it right. Over half of meetings in conference room spaces are single person in the meeting room alone. Do we have another question too, or not? Yeah, we go. Yeah.
oh, yeah, one other question. So, what percentage of people sit by themselves, nobody else in the same pod or neighborhood when they come into an office? So, 25%, 64%, 10%, or 85%? It looks like 64% is the winner here at 50% of our respondents, followed by I think 25% and
Yeah.
then 10%, but 85% was the least with only 5%.
That's funny. Well, sitting alone, I hope 85% of people don't sit alone. So people definitely took the more pessimistic view here. Maybe it's because of our last question. It's actually 25%. So, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, that a quarter of people come into the office and sit by themselves in a neighborhood or pod. And it sort of makes you ask the question, why do we go into the office at all? Which is what we're going to get to as this is the cue up for the next part of the conversation, your question of what the leadership teams care about. So if we go to what leadership teams care about, we've spent a lot of time working on this. And in a flexible work world, everyone sees the headlines, the battles, trying to get mandates of people into the office. In a flexible work world, we know that people can do work remotely. So the point of the workplace, the point of the office in a flexible work world is really this idea of getting people together and collaborating. That is the whole point of the office in the flexible work world. And then we have to then decide how good a job are we at doing that if when people come to the office, half of their meetings are sitting alone in a conference room and 25% of the time they're sitting alone by themselves in a pod. How good a job are we doing at driving collaboration? So when we think about CEOs, C-suite level folks, as they think about the office, they're more and more thinking about it is how is the office at a place that's a hub for driving collaboration. This is especially true for knowledge-based industries, professional services industries, even academia. We see this in academia. We have lots of academic customers. So across a broad array of industries, anyone who can do office work that could be remote, how do I make sure when they're coming to the office that the office is actually driving a collaborative atmosphere? And the problem always is we said, all right, a collaborative atmosphere is more about the vibe at the office, though. Well, it turns out you can actually measure how collaborative an office is. So, one thing that's really interesting, so there's a whole body of research out there about this, and we're going to cover a little bit about what that looks like, because this is what you can then take home and apply it to your workplaces. So there's an amazing study out there. This is peer-reviewed academic research that found at a large tech company that if you sat within 25 feet of a high performer, your performance automatically increased by 15%. So why? Why did that happen? Well, it happened for two reasons. So first reason was you heard what they were saying and everything. So you could overhear how they're approaching customer calls, whatever that might be. The second, or you could ask them questions about what they were doing, that sort of impromptu collaboration. The other important piece was peer pressure. Just like going to the gym, if you're working out next to somebody who's working out really hard, you're going to work out harder versus if you're sitting in your garage trying to get the motivation to work out and maybe not going to work as hard. Well, the same exact thing is true for work. So what we see is there's this body of research out there that actually shows that you can increase performance by coming to the office. That's why you're seeing leaders of companies saying we want more people in the office, but then you're seeing employees say, well, we don't know if it makes sense or not. The fact of the matter is they have to be returning to the right kind of office to be able to get these collaborative benefits. So what does the right kind of office look like? Well, once again, this is where, because we have hundreds of millions of data points in this subject, and we looked at deep into the research on it, it turns out there's three things that drive collaboration in the workplace. I'm going to talk about each of them because then we're going to talk about how you measure them and how you then manage your office to get the most out of those collaborative benefits. So the first piece is occupancy. What a lot of people said they're looking at occupancy data. So occupancy is a good place to start. So you definitely should be looking at occupancy data, but it definitely is just the start. So on the occupancy front, what's interesting is that if we look at the research shows that if I sit on the same floor as somebody else that is on the same team as me, I'm 6 times more likely to collaborate with that person than if I'm remote or sitting on a different floor. So we show that being on the same floor as someone is important. In fact, if I'm on a different team than somebody, I'm 9 times more likely to collaborate with that person than if I was remote or sitting on a different floor. And we probably all see these within our same organizations, that you get very siloed if you're not co-located, but if you become co-located, then all of a sudden you're much more likely to interact with those people. So occupancy is a really good starting spot. But if we go to the next piece, this idea of ad hoc collaboration and where are you sitting? So it turns out that we talked about sitting within 25 feet of high performers, the way you boost your performance. So that says you have to sit within 25 feet. And in fact, the research goes a step further. The research shows that 90% of collaboration in a workplace happens at the person's desk. So where people sit is actually the most important thing. So when you think about space planning, departments, what seats are assigned seats, what seats are flexible seating, getting that right is actually one of the most important thing you can do in creating a collaborative atmosphere within your office. So spending time and focusing deep on that is really, really important. In fact, there's a whole nother study about this that found if you're sitting near someone, it improved overall performance for the team by 10%. And the author said something, especially in time critical and sensitive situations. And what they found even more interesting, one of the studies, the research said this, was sitting on the other side if you sat on the other side of the room from somebody, you might as well have been sitting on the other side of the city. So figuring out what your seating plan looks like, how people are interacting with the office, this is why going that next level down below occupancy is really important. Then the final piece is planned collaboration. This actually gets exactly to what we talked about before, that meetings are an important way. So about that other 10%, so if you're wondering where that interaction in the workplace happens, 90% occurs at someone's desk. About 7% actually occurs in meetings, the benefit of meetings. And then about 3% is that at the water cooler, at the lunch table, everything else. We always spend all this time thinking about the water cooler and the coffee machine and the lunch table. It's actually seating is by far the most important thing. On the planned meeting side, so that planned collaboration in meetings, once again, we find that 53% of people are doing Zoom calls or doing remote calls all alone. So when you think about these 3 attributes, they line up really well with people's complaints about going into the office. Number 1 complaint, I went into the office and it was empty. occupancy. Number two complaint, I went to the office and I sat by myself, ad hoc collaboration. Number three complaint, I went to the office and I sat by myself all day doing video conference calls. So if you're not thinking about how to address these things, then you're not thinking about planning your space so that way you are in a place to thrive in this flexible workplace world. So what's interesting about, once again, using Robin as a use case is that we actually, and some of you answered this in the poll question, we looked at our data and we found that 80% of our planned meetings were actually occurring one person in a conference room. So we were getting our salespeople to come in, and then they were going off and having sales calls or having customer calls by themselves in meeting rooms. The issue with that is that helping drive, is that we're getting any benefits of collaboration if we're doing that? No, people might as well be sitting at home. So we actually made some real specific changes to our workplace layout, as well as some of our workplace policies. We created an anchor day for the sales team, and we've been able to drive that down substantially just by looking at the data and helping the team manage it. So when we think about what workplace leaders think about for what their office space should be driving, this collaboration benefit is the big one. When we talk to CEOs, C-suite, this is what they want to drive out of their workplace. Go on to the next
Thank you.
slide. Whoops,
Thank
this
you,
is Brian.
Micah.
Sorry, I
That
knew
was
you had a
very
question. Sorry.
that was very interesting. So, given all of this research, what are some of the implications for facilities teams?
Go, Brian.
Yeah. So how does all of this impact all of you? Well, I'd say frankly, like technology and data are unlocking new superpowers for facilities managers, right? It's not just about firefighting or keeping the trains running anymore, but we can become, a crucial input into the overall workplace strategy, right? We're used to questions like, oh, how much space does an engineering team need? Well, we'd answer that by looking at team size and occupancy rates. Or how many conference rooms do we need for the fourth floor when we build it out? And we'd answer that by looking at average room utilization and then, the expected head count on the floor and doing some basic math. Now we're able to base these decisions on much more powerful signal. We can use scheduling data along with generative and predictive AI to understand not just how often rooms are used, but what type of work they best support and how people are actually using them. We can understand how well our workplace, like Micah talked about, is driving or not driving collaboration. We can understand the nature of in-office work for engineering, how that might differ from a sales team, and make choices that drive better utilization and collaboration, and can rethink things like amenities and equipment that we're putting in within spaces to better align to the work that's being done in them. Obviously, things like better optimizing and automating services like cleaning and catering. And as facilities managers, you can now inform leadership in new and novel ways on how in-office policies and workplace strategy can be adjusted to drive better outcomes and more collaboration, which I think is pretty cool. To give a quick example, Micah talked about this a little bit. So, how I'm going to pick on sales and engineering and tell a story about our company. And this is sort of how we like to think about these groups or characterize them, right? Like sales, on the phone, on the floor, making calls, engineering, working sometimes, complaining about things all the time, playing foosball, hitting the beer taps. I'm an engineer myself, so of course this is accurate. And we ourselves were making workplace decisions and allocating resources to these teams based on these assumptions. More desks and fewer conference rooms for sales, more collaborative spaces near engineering, close proximity to the beer fridge, that kind of stuff. But you can go to the next slide. What we found when we actually looked at our data, we learned that these groups were using the office very similarly, which was unexpected. And knowing this allowed us to adjust our strategy, right? We use this information to craft new in-office policies and anchor days for the different teams, like Micah talked about. We reconfigured booking policies to get sales folks out of conference rooms and call booths because we wanted them taking calls on the floor where their coworkers could learn and absorb from those conversations. And just knowing this simple fact of, hey, we actually were not correct in our assumptions. We needed to actually go one level deeper into the data. and we weren't driving the behaviors that we wanted as a business, it was pretty eye-opening and allowed us in short order to make real changes to our own workplace strategy and how we do things.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. So, what does this actually look like in practice? What are practical applications for this for the audience today?
Yeah, so I want to tie this back a little bit to cost and real estate efficiency. The reality is that in facilities and real estate management, bringing down costs is still one of the more important goals. But we don't have to guess at decisions based on one-dimensional or anecdotal information, right? By understanding more holistically how the space is used, we can build much more accurate models that automatically recommend changes to drive cost savings, and not just based on occupancy, but on how the space is actually being used. And we can do this while elevating employee performance and increasing collaboration at the same time. And we can do this in a quantifiable, provable way, which frankly has never really been possible before.
And I think that gets, just to add in there, I think that's where it gets really interesting. What we see is that people are looking at very basic data. They're making decisions based to downsize space, and then they downsize space, they open a new office, and it's still empty. And they wonder what's going on. And I think what's interesting, back to if you look at that right level of data, that then what you find is that you can actually get the office right size and increase the collaboration, which once again is the business result that you want out of office space. So by looking at both these things, you can get it right. To Brian's point, this is where we can actually use some really interesting new machine learning models to predict what you need. And then at the same time, you can look at that collaboration data and show that you're delivering a win-win for the organization versus what we've seen in downsizing is people downsize an office space. If they have a lease renewal, they open up the new office, and then the office is not nearly as full as they were thinking it was going to be. And then the cycle continues. We see very few companies getting it right. And once again, it's because they're not looking at the right level of data to make those decisions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about then making decisions proactively. We're obviously talking to facilities team members as part of this webinar. In this idea of how do we get proactive in managing our facilities. And what's really interesting is the data we looked at, obviously this is what we get by having a digital workplace platform in place, allows you to collect much more rich data and then analyze that data and make more informed decisions from it. What's also interesting about it is allows you to get intent data, because not only does the digital workplace platform gather what's happened in the past, which is what occupancy does, but it also allows you to see what's going to happen in the future and then manage the facility such. And we see this with our customers so often, which is in a flexible work world, you see very different patterns emerging, especially if teams are having specific team days or if there's a customer event. We have customers that rearrange entire floors based on what type of customer event they have going on. So if we look at this, on the top is the Robin dashboard. We can see who's coming in each day. We can see that movement. We can see that looking forward. So we can see what that looks like. Once again, not just looking backwards. And in the bottom of this slide, what you can see is, hey, this is what my occupancy chart shows, right? Peaking in the middle of the week, like most offices do nowadays, very little people on Friday. But what we can see if we start looking forward by using digital workplace platforms is I can start doing predictive work and understanding what the workload is for my team. So we talked a lot about this from a real estate planning standpoint, but there's actually a lot we can do from a basic operations standpoint. So things like I have a customer event coming in Monday. I can see that through my platform now. I then understand what that event is. I understand what sort of room setups need to be done with it, AV setups, what type of food ordering might be done, need to be done. I can see that through obviously my visitor system also. I can see the engineering team is having a team day on Thursday, and we're going to be much more occupied on that day. So maybe I need to stock my snack bar or fridge with more items, or I need to put in an extra service request for that afternoon, so that way the garbage cans aren't full. So when you think about facilities management in general, this idea of getting proactive, especially what we're seeing is that people are kind of getting lulled into the sense of, well, this is what the normal workday looks like. We're seeing a fair amount of variability, especially if you're talking about individual offices. So getting ahead of that is really, really interesting. And once again, when we see demand around customers, is really focusing on, all right, how do I get better about managing these events that are happening in the future? Because what's happening is they're getting caught ad hoc. And that's another thing you see on the top as we show the Robin dashboard, this idea of meetings without spaces. So it happens very often in this world that people book meetings, but they're not sure who's going to be in the office. So they don't book a conference room for it. Then all of a sudden, there's not enough conference rooms for it. So helping manage that stuff is, in this flexible work world, really important. What we see is it's very easy for everyone to be at home. It's very easy to have people in the office, not easy, but it's easier to have people in the office 5 days a week. When you're somewhere in the between, that's when things get really hard. And clearly, by looking at the data, this is where not only can you make real estate decisions and planning decisions, but also dive deeper into how do I drive the operations of my workplace? How do I drive my facilities operations to match what the actual usage is going to look like in the future? So the big three things, we covered these in this webinar, and then we're going to open up to questions here shortly. The big three things that we see our best-in-class customers doing is they're looking at driving the data that we just talked about and using it for three things. They're looking at occupancy. They're then diving that next level deeper because they really want to understand how that drives real estate decisions, how they're designing the office in general. They're looking at that next level of data and understanding predictively what's happening. So looking at that intent data of how people are going to use the office to help make sure that the workplace experience and services associated with that in the office are set up to meet the needs of the office, because that's the worst thing that happens is people are coming in flexibly and then they have a bad experience in the office. Then the final piece is how to make sure that the office is actually achieving its core mission. And that's to drive in-person collaboration, because you can get the other two right, but if this one's not working, then you're going to answer more and more questions from your leadership team about what's the point of the office. So what driving around this idea of how we're creating a collaborative atmosphere, and beyond just having nice paintings on the wall or pretty paint colors, how are we actually driving in-person collaboration is really where we see management teams specifically focusing deeply, because that's what they're all wrestling with. How often do we get people in the office? What's our in-office mandate? That's kind of the most important question on their mind right now. And this is where you can be a real value-added partner to that conversation. I think that's what we have for content right now. So happy to turn it over to Q&A.
Perfect. Well, Micah, Brian, thank you guys so much for answering some of my questions today and for this presentation. And thank you to our audience members who've sent in some questions. I'll get started. Let's see here. So George was wondering, what are some initial steps facilities managers can take to start collecting and analyzing space data?
Yeah, so great question. I'll provide. So we talked about, if you're not looking at badge data is a really important piece. And that's definitely a good place to start. Typically, what we see the next level people do after that is start marrying that with department and other demographic data associated with who's using the space. That part, you saw some of that in our presentation, that once you can start marrying that data together, it gives you a better idea of not just how many people are coming to the office, but you can start then making some inferences about how the office is being used. Is engineering using a lot? How are those different departments using versus expectations? That will help you from the planning perspective. The other piece Brian talked a little bit about in his part is starting to look at whether it be in Microsoft or in Google, whatever your company uses, looking at how spaces, so specifically conference rooms, are being used. I think those are two really good places to start. Then clearly the next step is to stand up a workplace platform, which is not a heavy lift at all. You stand up a workplace platform like Robin, then you can start collecting the much, much deeper data associated with this and driving workplace decisions. And typically, it's when people are either contemplating a move within the next couple of years, where they need that data. That's a very normal, or they're trying to think about changes their office footprint. That's definitely a very normal use case for, hey, we need to start collecting some real data, because real estate, for professional services or knowledge-based industries, real estate's your second biggest cost item after employee costs. So you want to make sure you make the right decisions there. And as you know, real estate decisions are not unwound very easily at all. So getting the data right is really important. So you can definitely start with some of the data that you already have, and then you can make the jump into a workplace platform without a huge leap.
Yeah, and
Brian, anything to add to that?
yeah, just to add on, so badge data is great, but I would say that, the more signal, the better. So, we see companies using Wi-Fi access point data, badge data. You could, there's check-in data from systems like Robin. There's companies out there that use sensor data as well. The only thing I'd say about that is sensor data doesn't often give you a lot of information on what's actually happening in the space. It's typically just head count. But again, like the more input and signal, into the system, the better.
And the problem is, so the issue with flexible work is before we had flexible work en masse, what you had was I had a seating chart and I had occupancy data. And that's sort of, I could just say, all right, well, I've got my seating chart, so I know where people sit and everything else. The problem is marrying that together. The time when people use things now is really, really important. Because if I have two people sitting next to together on a seating chart, but one comes in on Mondays and Tuesdays, and the person next to them comes in on Thursdays and Fridays, I get no collaboration benefit whatsoever by having them sit together. So as you can see, the problem is this stuff gets complex really quickly. So if you don't have a system that's powerful enough to help you make sense of it all, so what we found is customers keep saying, well, we want more data. Well, they actually don't want data. They want analysis and insights that they can action on, because you can quickly get overwhelmed with data. So what you actually need is you need a system to analyze and then provide insights into the data. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed quickly. Once again, if you get into bringing the department stuff and then looking at days of the week and how people are using the seating chart on days of the week, you can imagine your head's going to be spinning very quickly. But unfortunately, that is sort of what you need to be looking at in this world. Because if marketing and sales interacting is really important, but marketing's coming on Thursdays and sales coming in on Monday, then it doesn't matter where you sat them on a seating chart. You're getting no benefit from having them seated close to each other. So this is the sort of stuff that people are trying to grapple with right now. And once again, there are, like Robin, there's systems in place to help you with it. It just gets complex quickly.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike and Brian, for your insights on that question. Um, Another question from Araz is, what confidence level would you assess your experimental data? How does various world regions impact that?
Yeah, I'll take that to start. So we have a very high confidence interval on our data. So we have tens of thousands of offices. What I was showing you in our collaboration score data was specifically, so first of all, the academic research is really clear on this front. And then marrying it with our data, 700 million data points around those offices. There definitely are regional influences. So for those that don't know, Asia by far the best at getting people to return to the office. Europe is second place, I'd say. Some countries better than others. UK is a bit far behind. Germany and some other countries are definitely much better about getting people to the office. US is worse. And then there's regional differences in the US. The coasts are in generally, just large generalities, worse than middle of the country, but even there's some specifics based on cities and everything. So there definitely is. But what we do in our benchmarking data is allow you to see that broad benchmark, so you can see where you stand against other workplaces. So we actually have an online calculator where you can estimate where your office sits. But once again, I think this value of, if the whole purpose of the office is to drive collaboration, if we're not thinking about managing an office to that goal, then we are fundamentally misaligned with management. And I think what we see is more and more teams starting to get aligned. And in fact, I had a customer say this, is that they're seeing that the line between IT and facilities is continuing to get blurred, obviously because facilities are becoming more technical, and IT is getting more and more deeply ingrained into the physical workspace. So they actually said that they see those two functions continuing to come together. So I think that's why we're seeing data becoming more and more important driver of these decisions in ways that we didn't see just 5 years ago.
Perfect. Well, Brian, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next question?
No, I just had to get my plug in the chat for the online calculator.
Um, so another question we have here is from Charlotte, who says, "Thank you. From your experience, are most companies requiring staff to badge in to access the facilities?" And she provided a little more context in saying that she is in a hybrid situation. Leadership have removed the requirement to badge in. Reservations are only made for staff that need to book hotel stations. So I'm challenged to have accurate utilization data.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we see most companies from a security standpoint do require people to badge in. Not all companies though, and it depends. It depends on the, and I don't know what industry you're in, Charlotte. So it definitely depends on industry. So some industries we see people don't require people to badge in. It's just not part of the culture of that industry. We have lots of higher education customers. They're open offices, open everything else, so they don't, as an example. Whereas lab spaces are totally locked out and you have to badge in 4 different times to get to a specific lab space. So once again, we see a broad variation. Brian mentioned it before. So back to that accurate number from an occupancy standpoint, that's where Wi-Fi can be a helpful piece. So that definitely, we actually have Wi-Fi check-in via the Robin app. You can also go to your Wi-Fi provider and see if you can get it, because what we see is certainly in some industries, some workplace cultures, badging in is not part. I'll say from a management standpoint, what we see from our experience is that, and listen, it is a cultural thing, so I can't say any company's right or wrong, but a lot of management teams mistakenly say, well, we want people to have free reign of the office. There's plenty of places for people to sit. So I'm not going to make them, we're not going to use a workplace management platform at all. And what happens is it ends up becoming this self-fulfilling prophecy that nobody else knows who's coming in. So then nobody comes in, and then the office is empty. And then the management team says, well, why would we need to use a booking solution if the office is empty? And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that nobody's there at all. And actually, what works well is when you can see who else is coming in, when people can plan team days, and you can see actually, I remember talking to one of our engineers last year. She said, well, she was in a day she wasn't normally in here. And I said, well, I didn't expect you to be in here today. And she said, oh, well, I saw the whole sales team was coming in today. So I have a bunch of friends in the sales team, so I wanted to come in myself. And in a flexible work world, we see that's what helps drive people into the office. So you're missing a big opportunity, and that's not to you, that's to your management team, that I think mistakenly people say, oh, well, we have an empty office, so therefore let's let people use it however, and that's going to drive more people to the office. Not the case at all. In fact, just like concert tickets that are hard to get, just like a restaurant that you can't get into, actually creating some constraints and seeing who else is in actually drives more people to the office. Brian, anything to add to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to the question on, how do we, if, badging's off the table, how do we get that clear picture of who's in, like Micah said, Wi-Fi? There's other ways to, like, the Robin app, for instance, can geofence you, or if we can, if you've reserved a room in the office, right, that signal that you're probably there. So all sorts of ways of sort of backing into it. And kind of like I said, I think 2 questions ago, like, really the more signal you can pull in from your business systems or workplace systems into, a workplace platform like Robin that can surface some of this stuff, the better, the clearer the picture
And
gets.
sensors, we didn't mention sensors. Sensors could be a good use case for that. I don't know how many entry points, but if you could use sensors near the entry points, once again, it depends on a workplace culture. We see some companies don't like to use sensors. Employees feel like they're getting tracked. Some places it's no problem to use. We definitely see customers using a variety of solutions to help get that data. So if you don't have tons of entry points, because sensors, they can get expensive if you outfit the entire office. But once again, if you can be strategic about the placement of them, and what's great about sensors is they can be integrated directly into a workplace platform like Robin. So they can then drive occupancy within a platform like Robin. So people don't have to take an additional step like badging in or checking in some other way.
Great, perfect. Thank you both for answering. So another question we have here is from Pablo. So how are new office layouts, so cubicles, single offices, conference rooms, etc., have seemed to be able to achieve some of the 3 points that you described during your presentation?
So Brian, I wanted to give you some time to answer this, but so I have a huge pet peeve on this one, so I'm gonna answer it first because I feel very strongly.
Oh,
So
go
what's
ahead. Go ahead.
crazy is we see this huge demand for people for cubicles again. So it's pretty amazing. So if you do an employee poll on this subject, they will say, I want the office to look like my home office. So I want it to be quiet. I want to have space on my own. So we see this demand for cubicles again, more conference room space, more phone booths, and everything else. The problem is, if you do that, you are going to be destroying the collaboration benefits of being in the office. And this discussion of, oh, geez, you're making me go into the office, but I'm sitting in a room by myself all day long is just going to continue to persist. So literally, employees will be coming in just to check the box because management says they have to come in, rather than actually building the collaboration benefits of the organization. So this is where you have to be really thoughtful. And so we're at one of our large customers. We're here in the Boston area. We're at their brand new office. They just did the same thing. So they did an employee poll. And what they found was employees really wanted lots more quiet space. So they just built out a beautiful brand new office, several floors, and they built in a bunch of quiet space. Guess what's not getting used at all? Quiet space, not being used at all. So this is why the being purposeful, and I think about communication too, which is, hey, your couple days a week at home is about your heads down time, your quiet time. Your couple days a week in the office is about your collaboration time. And we're managing a space. And once employees start using the office, they'll see that. But if you just do a poll, especially for a workforce that maybe isn't using the office very much, they're going to answer exactly how I described. So we see cubicle orders are off people can't keep cubicles in stock right now because people are, and then the office is empty after they build it out, or employees are saying, why are you bringing me back into the office? And once again, the cycle continues. So that's how we see people thinking about. So instead, think about what is a layout. So the types of companies that are being progressive on this are doing less cubicles, more seating that collaborative seating, a lot more soft seating. So we're seeing a lot more soft seating coming in. And then they're really focusing on this concierge experience. So this idea of your days in the office are more of an experience. We see people leaning into that a lot more. So this, whatever it is, the hotelification of the office space, whatever you want to call it, definitely the companies that are doing it well on the collaborative side, besides getting the seating chart right, getting the seating, everything else. That's the type of stuff we see them doing, Pablo. Brian, feel sorry to jump in there, but happy to have
No,
you
no,
come
just
in
to
too.
add on a little bit. So, many of you may remember a term that's been around for a while, still is used, called activity-based work. And it's the idea of building and architecting your space and design around meeting the activity and type of work that you want to see happening there. And it is this silly irony that we want to put cubicles back in where you're creating a worse version of the home office and adding a commute, and not taking advantage of why we have workplaces at all, really. So um, yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's I don't hear about activity-based working as much in recent years, but it's maybe more relevant. Maybe people are just using different terminology, but almost more relevant now than ever before.
Yeah, because when you think about that, when you think about activity-based work, what we've done is we've shifted that to different locations. That heads down activity, everything else, that's happening at home, and the activity that's happening in the office should be collaboration. So to Brian's point, you don't want to create an office that is focused on that heads down activity that should be happening at home.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you sharing your insights. And it's interesting. I'm noticing the same thing just about creating an experience when employees come into the office. When I've spoken to different facility managers and trying to, create an experience they can't get if they're at home, and comforts that they may not have access to if they're in their home spaces. But it looks like we are just about out of time. So I want to thank you, Micah and Brian, again for sharing some of your insights with us. And I want to send a special thank you to Robin for sponsoring this webinar. And of course, thank you to our audience for attending today and for sending in questions. Today's webinar will be made available on our magazine's website, facilityexecutive.com, and at robinpower.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everyone.